An abandoned dog, left heartbroken on a lonely road, fights through storms, predators, and unimaginable danger. But when he leaps onto a collapsing bridge to save a child's life, his journey takes a turn no one saw coming. What happens next will redefine loyalty and sacrifice forever. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. The sun was unrelenting, a golden blaze suspended high above the quiet expanse of a rural Texas highway. The asphalt shimmered with heat, and the air carried a dry, oppressive stillness. Bo sat in the back seat of the old, creaking sedan, his tail thumping softly against the worn leather. His brown eyes, filled with trust and unbridled loyalty, gazed at the familiar outline of his owner, Calvin, through the rearview mirror. For Bo, car rides always meant joy. A trip to the park, an adventure by the lake, or a chance to chase after birds, while Calvin watched with a smile. Today felt different, but Bo didn't notice. His tail wagged with excitement as the car slowed to a stop along a stretch of road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. Tall, wild grass swayed gently in the breeze, and the only sound was the distant hum of cicadas. Calvin gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. His face was etched with lines of stress and guilt. He glanced at Bo in the rearview mirror, and his chest tightened. Bo tilted his head, his ears perking up in anticipation. Calvin forced a weak smile, but it quickly faded. "I'm sorry, boy," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the suffocating silence in the car. Bo didn't understand the words, but he sensed something. The tone, the weight, the sadness. As the driver's side door creaked open, Bo leapt forward, his paws resting on the edge of the seat, ready to follow. Calvin stepped out and walked to the back door. When it opened, Bo jumped out eagerly, his tail wagging harder now. The sun beat down on them as Calvin knelt beside Bo. He reached out a trembling hand and scratched behind the dog's ears, a familiar gesture that made Bo lean into him. "You're a good boy, Bo. The best boy," Calvin said, his voice cracking. Bo barked softly, his tail brushing against Calvin's leg. His trust was absolute, his love unconditional. Calvin stood abruptly, unable to bear the weight of the moment any longer. He walked back to the car without another word. Bo watched him curiously, tilting his head as if to say, "What now? Are we playing a game?" His tail wagged slower, but didn't stop. The door slammed shut. The engine roared to life. Bo's ears perked up, and he bounded toward the car. Calvin gripped the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched. The car inched forward. "Wait!" Bo barked, his voice full of excitement and confusion. His paws pounded against the dirt road as he followed the car, certain this was part of the game. But the car didn't stop. It picked up speed, the tires spitting up gravel and dust. "Don't forget me!" Bo barked again, louder this time. His heart raced. Not from exertion, but from a feeling he couldn't name. An ache he had never known before. The car grew smaller in the distance, a silhouette against the blazing sun. Bo slowed to a trot, then a walk, his chest heaving. His tail, once wagging eagerly, now hung limp against his legs. He stopped, standing alone on the dusty road, watching the car disappear over the horizon. The only sound was the soft whisper of the wind. Bo stood there for a long moment, his brown eyes fixed on the empty road, as if willing the car to return. The world felt unbearably quiet. His body, strong and full of life, suddenly felt heavy. He turned in slow circles, searching for a familiar scent, a sign, anything to tell him this wasn't real. The wind carried no answers. The road stretched endlessly ahead, a cruel reminder of how far he was from the life he had known. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the road, Bo's instinct kicked in. He needed water, shelter, and answers. He padded forward, his paws kicking up small clouds of dust. His throat was parched, and the heat clung to him like a heavy blanket. A lone tree stood ahead, its branches offering a sliver of shade. Bo reached it and lay down, his body sinking into the coolness of the dirt beneath. He rested his head on his paws, his eyes scanning the horizon. He stayed there for hours, his body still but his mind restless. He didn't know what abandonment was, but he felt it in every fibre of his being. The sun sank below the horizon, and darkness crept over the landscape. The chirping of crickets filled the air, and a cool breeze ruffled Beau's fur. For a fleeting moment he closed his eyes and thought of home. He could see the faces of the children he loved, hear their laughter, feel the warmth of their tiny hands patting his head. The memory was so vivid, it almost felt real. When Beau opened his eyes again, the night had fully claimed the world. A chill ran through him, and his ears twitched at a distant sound. A low, mournful howl echoed through the night, followed by another, and then another. The coyotes were near. Beau lifted his head, his ears alert, his muscles tensing instinctively. He wasn't safe here. Pushing himself to his feet, Beau began walking again. His steps were slow, his body weighed down by exhaustion and hunger, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Somewhere deep inside him, a small flame of hope burned, fragile but alive. As he moved forward, his scarred ear flicked back toward the howls, which grew louder with each passing moment. The coyotes were closing in, their cries filling the night with a sinister melody. Beau quickened his pace, his paws striking the ground with urgency. In the distance, he spotted the faint outline of an old barn. It stood like a ghost against the night sky, its wooden frame weathered and worn. Beau headed for it, his heartbeat steady but strong. He didn't know what he would find there, but it was shelter, and for now, that was enough. As the first stars began to pierce the darkness above, Beau slipped through the broken door of the barn, his chest heaving. He curled up in a corner, his body trembling, but his spirit unbroken. The barn creaked around him, the wind whistling through its cracks. Outside, the howls grew distant, and the night settled into an uneasy silence. Beau rested his head on his paws, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. As he drifted into an uneasy sleep, his dreams were filled with flashes of his old life, a warm home, laughter, love, the life he had lost. But even in his dreams, he never stopped hoping. Somewhere, deep in his heart, he believed, they will come back for me. They have to. Morning broke quietly over the empty fields, the golden light of dawn spreading slowly across the endless stretch of road. Beau stirred beneath the shelter of the old barn, his body aching from the relentless trek of the previous day. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of dew-covered grass, but it did little to soothe the dryness in his throat. His tongue, parched and heavy, lolled out as he panted softly. Beau rose to his feet, his legs trembling slightly under the weight of his exhaustion. He sniffed the air instinctively, his ears twitching for any sound of life. The barn was lifeless, save for the distant creak of wood shifting in the wind. The silence pressed against him like an invisible force, and Beau knew he couldn't stay. The world outside, as harsh and unfamiliar as it was, still held the faint promise of something better. He stepped out into the light, the morning sun warming his golden fur. His eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of water or food. The road stretched endlessly before him, a ribbon of grey cutting through the fields of dry, swaying grass. Somewhere far off, a bird called out, its cry sharp and fleeting, and Beau turned toward the sound. His paws moved instinctively, one after the other, guiding him forward with a quiet determination. The coolness of the morning began to give way to the harsh heat of the day, and each step grew heavier as the sun climbed higher into the sky. Beau's shadow stretched long and thin behind him, a silent companion on his solitary journey. The first hour passed in silence, broken only by the soft crunch of gravel beneath his paws. As the road dipped and curved, Beau's nose caught a faint scent in the air, damp earth, rich and promising. His steps quickened, driven by a growing desperation. Ahead, nestled between the tall grass, a shallow puddle glistened in the sunlight. Beau approached it cautiously, his instincts sharpened by the loneliness of the road. He lowered his head and lapped at the water, the cool liquid soothing his dry throat. It wasn't clean, tinged with mud and specks of dirt, but Beau drank greedily, savouring every drop. For a moment the world seemed less harsh, and a flicker of hope returned to his tired eyes. When the puddle was drained, Beau sat back on his haunches, his chest rising and falling with deep breaths. He gazed at the horizon, his mind drifting to memories of home. He could almost hear the laughter of the children, the clatter of dishes in the kitchen, the soothing murmur of Calvin's voice. The images were fleeting but vivid, like flashes of a life that felt both near and impossibly far away. As the sun climbed higher, the road became a grueling test of endurance. The heat shimmered off the asphalt, distorting the air and making the distant trees sway like phantoms. Bo pressed on, his steps slower now, his ears drooping with fatigue. His stomach growled, a sharp reminder of his growing hunger. But there was no food in sight, only the endless expanse of road and the unforgiving sun above. It was mid-afternoon when Bo spotted the barn in the distance. Its weathered frame stood out against the flat landscape, a relic of a forgotten time. Bo hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the structure. It was old and crumbling, but it offered shade, perhaps even food. He turned off the road, his paws crunching through the dry grass as he approached. The barn smelled of dust and age, the air thick with the scent of hay long since rotted. Bo stepped inside, his movements cautious and deliberate. He sniffed the ground, searching for any trace of sustenance, but the barn was as empty as the fields outside. Still, the shade was a welcome relief, and Bo lay down in a corner, his body sinking into the cool dirt. His rest was short-lived. A sharp sound, footsteps on gravel, pricked his ears, and Bo's head snapped up. He froze, his muscles tensing as he listened. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the faint hum of a voice. A man appeared in the doorway, his figure outlined by the harsh sunlight behind him. "Now, what do we have here?" the man said, his voice rough but curious. He was old, with a wiry frame and weathered hands that spoke of years spent working the land. His name was Eli, though Bo couldn't know that yet. Eli stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the dog. Bo remained still, his body low to the ground, his tail tucked under him. He didn't trust this stranger, but neither did he sense immediate danger. "Easy there, boy," Eli said, crouching down and extending a hand. "You look like you've been through hell." Bo sniffed the air, his nose twitching. The man smelled of earth and sweat. But there was something else, a faint trace of kindness that put Bo slightly at ease. Slowly, cautiously, he crept forward, his movements deliberate and wary. Eli reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of jerky. "Here," he said, placing it on the ground. "You've earned it." Bo hesitated, his eyes darting between the man and the food. Hunger won out, and he inched closer, his nose brushing against the jerky before he took it in his mouth. The salty flavour was overwhelming but satisfying, and Bo chewed slowly, savouring every bite. Eli watched him, his expression softening. "You're a good dog," he said, his voice quieter now. "Been on your own for a while, haven't you?" Bo didn't respond, but his eyes, filled with a quiet gratitude, seemed to answer for him. Eli reached out cautiously, his hand brushing against Bo's fur. Bo didn't flinch, and the man smiled faintly. "You need a sign," Eli muttered, more to himself than to the dog. He stood and rummaged through a nearby toolbox, pulling out a red bandana. With careful hands, he tied it loosely around Bo's neck. "There," he said, stepping back to admire his work. "Now people know you're not just some stray." Bo tilted his head, the fabric resting lightly against his fur. It was a small gesture, but it carried a weight of meaning that Bo couldn't fully comprehend. Eli stood and dusted off his hands. "Wish I could keep you," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "But I ain't got much to give." Bo watched as Eli turned and walked away, his footsteps growing softer until they faded into the distance. Alone once more, Bo stepped out of the barn and onto the road. The bandana swayed gently in the breeze, a small but significant reminder of the kindness he had encountered. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the landscape. Bo walked steadily, his resolve unshaken. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but somewhere, beyond the horizon, was the life he was fighting to reclaim. As dusk began to settle, the howls of coyotes pierced the air once more. Bo's ears twitched, and his steps quickened. The wilderness was no place for rest. Not yet. Night descended swiftly, cloaking the desolate landscape in a shroud of darkness. The faint glow of the moon struggled to penetrate the thick canopy of trees as Bo stepped cautiously into the forest. The road had faded into the background, and with it, the faint sense of security it had provided. The forest was alive with sound, rustling leaves, distant chirps, and the occasional snap of a twig. But the most chilling sound of all was the low, mournful howls that echoed through the night. The coyotes were close. Bo's paws pressed silently into the soft earth as he moved deeper into the woods. His ears twitched with every sound, his nose working overtime to detect any sign of immediate danger. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, and the ache in his legs from miles of walking weighed him down. But the instinct to survive, to press forward, was stronger than his exhaustion. The forest grew denser as Bo ventured further, the trees forming an almost impenetrable barrier against the pale moonlight. Shadows danced around him, twisting and shifting with each movement. His scarred ear flicked back at the sound of a snapping branch, and his body tensed instinctively. He stopped, his breath shallow, listening intently. The howls came again, louder this time, and Bo turned his head sharply toward the sound. His heart pounded in his chest as his muscles coiled, ready to spring into action. The air was thick with the scent of predators, a sharp, acrid smell that set every nerve in his body on edge. They were closing in. A rustle to his right made Bo whip around, his teeth bared in a low, warning growl. His tail, usually a signal of joy, was stiff and low, a testament to his readiness to fight if needed. The coyotes emerged from the shadows one by one, their eyes gleaming with predatory intent. There were 3 of them, their lean bodies moving fluidly through the underbrush as they circled Bo. The leader of the pack, a grizzled male with matted fur and a notched ear, stepped forward. He bared his teeth, his lips curling back to reveal sharp, yellowed fangs. His growl was low and menacing, a sound that sent a chill down Bo's spine. Bo stood his ground, his chest heaving as he growled in response. He was outnumbered and weakened, but retreat wasn't an option. His mind flashed to the faces of the children he had loved, the warmth of their laughter, the safety of home. That memory ignited a spark of courage deep within him. He wouldn't go down without a fight. The first coyote lunged, its jaws snapping dangerously close to Bo's face. Bo dodged to the side, his movements quick despite his fatigue. He snapped back, his teeth grazing the coyote's shoulder. The animal yelped and retreated slightly, circling back to join its pack. The second coyote moved in, aiming low, its jaws closing around Bo's front leg. Pain shot through him, but Bo twisted sharply, breaking free and countering with a bite to the coyote's flank. The leader watched, his yellow eyes calculating as his pack tested Bo's strength. Bo's growls grew louder, more ferocious, as he fought off each attack. His body ached. His breaths came in ragged gasps, but he refused to back down. The leader finally made his move, lunging straight for Bo's throat. The 2 collided with a force that sent them rolling across the forest floor. Bo's jaws clamped down on the coyote's neck, his strength fueled by pure adrenaline. The coyote thrashed and clawed, but Bo held firm, his growls vibrating through the night air. The other coyotes hesitated, their confidence wavering as their leader struggled. One by one, they backed away, their tails tucked low as they melted back into the shadows. The leader finally broke free, his body tense with rage and humiliation. He let out a sharp bark, a signal for retreat, before slinking away into the darkness. Bo stood alone in the clearing, his body trembling with exhaustion. Blood dripped from a wound on his leg, and his fur was matted with dirt and sweat. His breaths came in shallow pants, each one a reminder of the brutal fight he had just endured. He scanned the darkness, his ears perked and his muscles tense, but the forest had gone quiet once more. He limped to a nearby tree and collapsed against its base, his body sinking into the soft earth. The adrenaline that had carried him through the fight began to fade, replaced by a deep, throbbing pain. Bo lowered his head to his paws, his eyes heavy with fatigue. He was too tired to move, too weak to care about the danger that still lingered in the shadows. The world around him blurred, the edges of his vision softening as he drifted into an uneasy sleep. His dreams were fragmented, flashes of faces and voices that felt both familiar and distant. He saw Calvin's face, lined with worry, his voice calling out Bo's name. He saw the children, their laughter ringing out like a melody. He saw the swing in the backyard, swaying gently in the breeze. Bo's eyes opened slowly, his dreams fading like smoke in the wind. The first light of dawn filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of dew and pine. Bo pushed himself to his feet, wincing as pain shot through his injured leg. He licked at the wound instinctively, his tongue brushing against the dried blood. He needed to keep moving. The forest stretched out before him, an endless maze of trees and shadows. Bo's steps were slow and deliberate, his body protesting with every movement. He paused occasionally to sniff the air, his ears swiveling at the faintest sound. The memory of the coyotes lingered in his mind, a reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. As the morning wore on, the trees began to thin, and the forest gave way to a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a stream, its clear water sparkling in the sunlight. Bo approached it cautiously, his steps tentative as he scanned the area for any signs of danger. When he was satisfied that he was alone, he lowered his head to the water and drank deeply. The cool liquid soothed his throat and washed away the lingering taste of blood. Bo drank until his thirst was quenched, then stepped back and lay down by the edge of the stream. The gentle sound of running water filled the air, a soothing backdrop to the silence of the clearing. Bo closed his eyes, his body relaxing for the first time in what felt like days. He was far from home, far from the life he had known. But for this moment, he allowed himself to rest. The forest was still, the shadows receding as the sun climbed higher into the sky. But Bo's journey was far from over. Somewhere beyond the trees, beyond the road that stretched endlessly ahead, was the life he was fighting to reclaim. And he would keep fighting, no matter the cost. The afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the forest. The air was thick and heavy, carrying the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Bo trudged along the forest's edge, his body battered and his steps slow. His injured leg throbbed with every movement, but he pressed on, driven by an instinct as old as the earth itself: survival. The first drop of rain was cold against his nose, startling him slightly. He paused, tilting his head toward the darkening sky. Above, thick grey clouds gathered like an army, rumbling softly and warning. Bo's ears twitched, catching the distant growl of thunder. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and bending the tall grass around him. It was a storm, and it was coming fast. Bo scanned his surroundings, his sharp eyes searching for shelter. The forest, dense and full of shadows, was no place to weather the fury of the storm. He moved quickly, his body low to the ground, his injured leg dragging slightly behind him. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of ozone. Lightning split the sky in a brilliant flash, followed by the deafening crack of thunder. The rain came suddenly, a torrent of water that soaked Bo's fur and turned the ground to mud beneath his paws. He struggled to maintain his footing, his claws slipping on the slick earth. His breath came in short bursts, a mixture of effort and rising panic. The storm was relentless, the wind lashing at him from all sides, the rain blinding him as it poured in sheets. Through the chaos, Bo spotted something in the distance, a structure, faint and weathered, but standing firm against the storm. It was a house, its silhouette barely visible through the rain. Hope surged within him, giving his tired legs a renewed strength. He stumbled toward it, his body trembling with the effort of each step. The house was old and abandoned, its windows shattered and its wooden boards warped from years of neglect. Bo hesitated at the threshold, sniffing the air cautiously. The scent of decay and damp wood filled his nose, but there was no sign of immediate danger. He pushed the door open with his nose, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was stale but dry, a welcome relief from the relentless storm outside. Bo limped to a corner of the room, his body sinking onto the cool, dusty floor. His chest heaved as he caught his breath, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. The sound of rain hammering against the roof was deafening, but here, in the safety of the house, it was distant enough to offer a strange comfort. Bo closed his eyes, his mind drifting to memories of home. The sound of the storm outside reminded him of nights spent curled up by the fireplace, the children's laughter ringing in his ears as they played nearby. He could almost feel the warmth of the fire against his fur, the gentle touch of a small hand stroking his head. A sudden noise jolted Bo from his thoughts. His ears perked up, and his eyes snapped open, scanning the room. The sound had come from outside, a faint rustling, barely audible over the rain. Bo rose to his feet, his body tense as he moved toward the broken window. He peered out into the storm, his sharp eyes narrowing as he searched the darkness. There, just beyond the edge of the house, was a faint figure. It moved slowly, its outline blurred by the rain. Bo let out a low growl, his instincts warning him to stay alert. The figure paused, its head turning toward the house. For a moment, Bo's growl faded, replaced by curiosity. It was a woman, her clothes soaked through, her movements cautious and deliberate. The woman, Martha, was a reclusive figure who lived in a small cabin nearby. She'd been out collecting firewood when the storm hit, forcing her to seek shelter. Her sharp eyes caught the faint light from the broken window, drawing her toward the abandoned house. Bo watched her carefully as she approached, his body low and his tail stiff. Martha paused at the doorway, her hand resting on the frame as she peered inside. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw Bo, her lips parting in surprise. "Well, aren't you a sight?" she said softly, her voice barely audible over the storm. Bo didn't move, his eyes locked on hers. Martha stepped inside cautiously, her movements slow and deliberate. She knelt down a few feet away from him, her eyes scanning his matted fur and the red bandana tied loosely around his neck. "You've been through it, haven't you?" she murmured, her voice gentle. Bo didn't respond, but his body relaxed slightly. There was something in her voice, a softness, a kindness, that eased his tension. Martha reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small piece of bread, placing it on the floor between them. "Here," she said, sitting back on her heels. "It's not much, but it's all I've got." Bo hesitated, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Hunger gnawed at him, but he remained still, his eyes watching her every move. Martha didn't press him, her hands resting calmly in her lap as she waited. Finally, Bo stepped forward, his movements cautious. He sniffed the bread, his nose brushing against her hand as he took it in his mouth. The taste was bland but satisfying, and Bo chewed slowly, savouring every bite. Martha smiled faintly, her hand reaching out to brush against his fur. Bo didn't flinch, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a connection that transcended words. "You're a fighter," Martha said quietly. "I can see it in your eyes." Bo lowered his head, his ears flicking back slightly. Martha rose to her feet, her eyes scanning the room. She noticed a broken chair in the corner and moved to sit on it, the wood creaking under her weight. She pulled out her phone and snapped a quick photo of Bo, her fingers typing quickly as she posted it to a local community page. "Maybe someone's looking for you," she said, her voice more to herself than to him. The storm raged on outside, the wind howling and the rain hammering against the roof. Bo lay back down, his body curling into a tight ball as he drifted into an uneasy sleep. Martha watched him for a while, her mind racing with questions about the dog and the life he must have left behind. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving the world drenched and quiet. Martha was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of her presence. Bo rose to his feet, his body stiff but his spirit unbroken. He stepped out into the light, the red bandana around his neck fluttering gently in the breeze. The road stretched out before him once more, but now it carried a sense of direction. Bo moved forward, his steps steady and his resolve strong. Somewhere, beyond the horizon, his journey awaited. The morning air was crisp, a stark contrast to the storm that had raged through the night. The ground was damp beneath Bo's paws, the earthy scent of wet soil mingling with the freshness of the new day. His steps were slow but steady as he moved through the thinning forest, the towering trees gradually giving way to an open expanse. The sky was a pale blue, streaked with the soft hues of dawn, but Bo's focus remained fixed on the road ahead. The faint sound of rushing water reached his ears, carried by a light breeze. His ears perked up, and his pace quickened slightly despite the ache in his injured leg. The sound grew louder as he approached the edge of a steep ravine, where a narrow suspension bridge stretched across the chasm. The bridge was old and worn, its wooden planks weathered and its ropes frayed, swaying gently in the wind. Bo paused at the edge, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. The bridge was treacherous, but it was the only way forward. He stepped cautiously onto the first plank, his claws scraping against the wood as he tested its strength. The bridge creaked under his weight, the sound echoing through the ravine. But it held firm. He took another step, then another, his body low and his movements deliberate. As he reached the center of the bridge, a sudden noise made him stop. A voice, young, panicked, and trembling with fear, called out from somewhere ahead. "Help! Somebody, please!" Bo's ears shot up, his head snapping toward the source of the sound. On the far side of the bridge, a boy clung desperately to one of the ropes, his feet dangling over the edge. His backpack lay abandoned a few feet away, its contents scattered across the planks. The boy's face was pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the rope with all his strength. Bo's instincts kicked in. Without hesitation, he moved forward, his paws steady despite the swaying of the bridge. The boy's voice grew more frantic as Bo approached, the desperation in his cries slicing through the air. "Help me! I'm slipping!" Bo reached the boy just as one of the rope's strands snapped with a sharp twang. The bridge tilted dangerously, the planks groaning under the strain. The boy's grip faltered, his body sliding further toward the edge. Bo lunged forward, his teeth clamping down on the boy's jacket. He pulled with all his strength, his muscles straining as the boy's weight shifted back onto the bridge. The boy gasped, his chest heaving as he scrambled to his knees. His eyes, wide with fear and disbelief, met Bo's. For a moment, neither of them moved, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Then the boy reached out, his trembling hand brushing against Bo's wet fur. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rushing water below. Bo stepped back, his tail wagging faintly as he watched the boy regain his footing. The boy, whose name was Ryan, stood shakily, his legs trembling beneath him. He looked at Bo with a mixture of gratitude and awe, his hands still clutching the frayed rope. You saved me," Ryan said, his voice breaking. "How did you even—" Before he could finish, a loud crack echoed through the ravine. The bridge shuddered violently, one of its main ropes snapping and sending planks tumbling into the chasm below. Ryan froze, his eyes widening in terror. "We have to get off this thing," he shouted, his voice rising in panic. Bo barked sharply, his body low as he turned, and began moving back toward the far side of the bridge. Ryan followed, his steps hurried and uneven as the bridge swayed beneath them. The remaining ropes groaned under the strain, their frayed edges threatening to give way at any moment. As they neared the end of the bridge, another rope snapped, tilting the structure sharply to one side. Ryan cried out, his arms flailing as he struggled to keep his balance. Bo barked again, his sharp, commanding tone cutting through Ryan's panic. The boy steadied himself, his hands gripping the ropes tightly as he inched forward. With a final leap, Bo reached solid ground, his paws landing firmly on the dirt. He turned back, his eyes locked on Ryan as the boy made the last, desperate push to safety. Just as Ryan's feet touched the ground, the bridge collapsed behind him, the planks and ropes falling into the ravine with a deafening crash. For a moment, the two of them stood in silence, their breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. Ryan sank to his knees, his hands clutching the ground as he tried to steady himself. Bo approached him cautiously, his tail wagging slightly as he nudged Ryan's arm with his nose. Ryan looked up, his face pale and streaked with tears. He reached out, his hand resting gently on Bo's head. "You're incredible," Ryan said, his voice trembling. "I don't know where you came from, but I owe you everything." Bo's eyes softened, his head tilting slightly as he watched the boy. There was a quiet understanding between them, a connection forged in the face of danger. Ryan sat back on his heels, his hand still resting on Bo's fur as he took a deep, shuddering breath. After a moment, Ryan straightened, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Where are you from?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "You've got that bandana. Someone must be missing you." Bo didn't respond, but his tail wagged faintly, the red bandana around his neck catching the light of the morning sun. Ryan smiled faintly, wiping his face with the sleeve of his jacket. "Well, wherever you're going," he said, "you're not going alone. I'll help you." Ryan stood, his legs still shaky but his resolve strong. He picked up his backpack, slinging it over one shoulder, and looked down at Bo. "Let's go," he said, his voice steady. "We'll figure this out together." Bo barked softly, his tail wagging a little more confidently. The two of them set off, their steps in sync as they moved away from the ravine. The sun climbed higher into the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape as the road stretched out before them. It was the beginning of a new chapter in Bo's journey, one marked not only by survival, but by the unexpected bond he had formed with a boy who needed him just as much as he needed the boy. The day stretched into early evening as Bo and Ryan continued their journey along the winding dirt road. The warmth of the sun had begun to fade, replaced by the soft, golden light of dusk. Ryan walked slightly ahead, his backpack bouncing lightly with each step, while Bo trotted beside him, his injured leg no longer as stiff. The boy occasionally glanced down at his companion, his thoughts racing with questions he couldn't yet answer. "So," Ryan said, breaking the silence, "you've been out here a while, huh?" His voice was soft, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "I mean, the way you handled that bridge. You're not just any dog." Bo glanced up at him, his tail swaying slightly, as if to acknowledge the compliment. The boy smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Whoever you belong to," Ryan continued, "they must miss you like crazy." The road ahead began to change, the barren landscape giving way to signs of life. Fences lined the path, some weathered and broken, others freshly mended. Small farmhouses dotted the horizon, their lights glowing warmly against the encroaching darkness. The sight filled Ryan with a sense of hope. Maybe someone nearby could help them. As they approached a larger, more elaborate property, Bo's pace quickened, his ears perked up, and his nose twitched as he sniffed the air. The scent was faint but familiar, stirring something deep within him. He barked once, a sharp, clear sound that startled Ryan. "Whoa, what is it?" Ryan asked, crouching slightly to steady Bo, who had begun to pull forward with newfound energy. The dog's eyes were fixed on the distant outline of a house, its silhouette strikingly familiar against the fading light. Bo barked again, his tail wagging furiously as he broke into a trot. Ryan hesitated, his brow furrowing as he watched the dog's sudden burst of enthusiasm. "Wait, hold on," Ryan called, scrambling to catch up. "You know this place, don't you?" The boy followed Bo as the dog led him down a narrow dirt path, lined with wildflowers and overgrown weeds. The air was thick with the scent of evening dew, and the chirping of crickets filled the silence. Ahead, the house grew larger, its weathered shutters and faded paint telling a story of time and neglect. The swing in the front yard swayed gently in the breeze, its creaking a ghostly echo of a once lively home. Bo slowed as they reached the gate, his body stiff with both anticipation and hesitation. He sniffed the ground, his ears swiveling as he listened for any familiar sounds. Ryan stepped beside him, resting a hand on the gate's rusted latch. "This is it, isn't it?" Ryan said softly, his eyes scanning the property. "You're home." Bo didn't move, his gaze fixed on the house, as if willing it to respond. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn, and the yard overgrown with weeds. It looked abandoned, but the faintest wisp of smoke curled from the chimney, a sign that someone was still inside. Ryan pushed the gate open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. Bo stepped forward cautiously, his paws crunching against the gravel path. As they neared the house, Bo's tail lowered slightly, his confidence giving way to uncertainty. The door that had once opened to warm greetings and loving hands now stood closed, its surface weathered and cracked. Ryan knelt beside Bo, his hand resting on the dog's back. "Do you want me to knock?" he asked gently. Bo didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the door. Ryan took a deep breath and stood, his fist hovering over the door for a moment before he knocked. The sound echoed through the house, followed by a tense silence. Ryan glanced down at Bo, who remained still, his ears twitching slightly. Then, faint footsteps echoed from within, growing louder as they approached the door. It creaked open slowly, revealing a man whose face was a canvas of weariness and regret. Calvin stood in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight before him. He froze when his gaze landed on Bo, his breath hitching audibly. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the world narrowing to the space between the man and the dog. "Bo?" Calvin's voice was barely above a whisper, his hands gripping the doorframe as if to steady himself. The dog took a tentative step forward, his tail wagging hesitantly. Calvin dropped to his knees, his hands reaching out, trembling. I thought I'd lost you," Calvin choked out, his voice thick with emotion. Bo moved closer, his nose brushing against Calvin's outstretched hand. The man let out a shuddering breath, his fingers curling into the dog's fur. Ryan watched from a few steps back, his chest tightening at the raw display of emotion. He couldn't help but smile faintly, the connection between the two undeniable. Calvin pulled Bo closer, his arms wrapping around the dog as tears streamed down his face. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I never should have left you." Bo's tail wagged harder, his body pressing against Calvin's as if to say, "It's okay, I'm here now." From inside the house, a woman appeared, her features softening as she took in the scene. "Calvin?" she asked, her voice filled with both confusion and relief. "Is that—" "It's Bo," Calvin said, his voice steadier now. "He came back." The woman, Anna, stepped forward, her eyes welling with tears. She knelt beside Calvin, her hands reaching out to stroke Bo's fur. "I can't believe it," she murmured, her voice trembling. "He found his way back." Ryan shifted slightly, unsure of where he fit into this reunion. Anna noticed him and offered a kind smile. Did you bring him here?" Ryan scratched the back of his head, his cheeks reddening slightly. "Not really," he admitted. "He found me, saved me actually. He's incredible." Anna's eyes softened and she nodded. "That sounds like Bo," she said with a faint laugh. Calvin stood slowly, his hand never leaving Bo's head. He turned to Ryan, his expression one of gratitude and remorse. "Thank you," he said, his voice firm, "for bringing him back." Ryan shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "He's the one who did all the work. I just followed." The family ushered them inside, the warmth of the house a stark contrast to the coolness of the evening air. Bo settled near the fireplace, his body relaxing for the first time in days. Calvin and Anna hovered nearby, their hands never straying far from the dog who had brought their family back together. As the evening stretched into night, the house filled with the quiet sounds of laughter, conversation, and the occasional crackle of the fire. Bo watched his family, his tail wagging softly as he drifted into a peaceful sleep. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he was home. The house felt alive again, but in a quieter, more solemn way. Bo lay curled up on a plush rug by the fireplace, his red bandana still tied loosely around his neck. The firelight danced across the walls, casting flickering shadows that seemed to echo the warmth now returning to the household. The years of neglect had left their mark on this home. Cracks in the walls, furniture pushed aside as though it were forgotten. But tonight it carried an air of hope. Calvin sat on the couch, his elbows resting on his knees and his head bowed low. His hands trembled as they cupped a steaming mug of coffee, though he barely noticed its heat. Across the room, Anna sat in a worn armchair, her eyes fixed on Bo. Ryan, perched on the edge of a nearby stool, was recounting how the dog had saved his life. "And then he just ran onto the bridge," Ryan said, his voice breaking slightly. "Didn't even hesitate. I thought we were both done for, but he got me out of there. I don't know how, but he did." Anna's hand covered her mouth, her eyes glistening. Calvin looked up, his face etched with guilt and something else, an understanding that this dog, abandoned by his own hand, had saved not just a stranger, but a child. "Bo's always been that way," Calvin said quietly. His voice carried the weight of memories. "Loyal to a fault. Even when—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Ryan's gaze flickered between Calvin and Bo. "Why'd you leave him?" the boy asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. Calvin winced at the question, his grip tightening around the mug. Anna shifted in her seat, her hands wringing nervously. "It wasn't something I wanted to do," Calvin began, his voice thick with emotion. "We were drowning in debt, bills piling up, the kids. They needed things I couldn't give them anymore, and I thought—" He broke off, his throat tightening. "I thought letting him go would be better for everyone," he continued after a long pause. "But it wasn't. It was the worst mistake I've ever made." His voice cracked on the last word, and he set the mug down, burying his face in his hands. Anna reached out, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "We all made mistakes, Calvin," she said gently. "But Bo, he forgave us. He came back." The dog's ears twitched at the sound of his name. He lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting Calvin's across the room. Calvin swallowed hard, his heart aching at the sight of the dog he had once abandoned. "I don't deserve him," Calvin whispered, his voice barely audible. Bo, as if sensing the heaviness in the air, rose unsteadily to his feet. His movements were slow, his body still weak from the journey, but his eyes were filled with warmth and understanding. He limped over to Calvin, his tail wagging faintly. The man dropped to his knees, his hands reaching out to cradle Bo's face. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he pressed his forehead gently against the dog's. "I'm so sorry," he murmured. "I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you." Bo let out a soft whine, his tail wagging a little more. His forgiveness was simple, unconditional, a kind of love that transcended human understanding. As the hours passed, the conversation turned lighter, filled with laughter and shared memories of Bo's younger days. Anna brought out a box of old photos, and the three of them pored over the images. Pictures of Bo as a puppy, his fur a fluffier version of its golden sheen now. Photos of the children playing with him in the yard, their faces glowing with joy. Ryan listened intently, his admiration for the dog growing with each story. He glanced at Bo, who now lay with his head resting on Calvin's lap, his eyes half closed in contentment. "He's more than a dog," Ryan said softly. "He's a hero." Calvin looked down at Bo, his fingers gently stroking the dog's fur. "He always was," he said quietly. The next morning, the family decided to do something they hadn't done in years, spend time in the backyard together. The sun was warm, casting a golden glow over the garden. Though overgrown with weeds, the space still carried the echoes of happier times. Calvin carefully lifted Bo, cradling him in his arms as they stepped outside. The dog's body was lighter than Calvin remembered, a stark reminder of the hardships he had endured. Anna and Ryan followed, their eyes scanning the yard. Underneath the old oak tree where Bo had often napped in his younger days, they spread out a blanket. Calvin set Bo down gently, ensuring the dog was comfortable. "I'll fix this place up," Calvin said, his voice firm with determination. "Make it like it used to be, for him, for all of us." Anna smiled, her hand resting on his arm. "We can do it together." Ryan nodded, his eyes bright. "Count me in." They spent the morning pulling weeds, trimming overgrown bushes, and planting new flowers. Bo watched them from his spot under the tree, his tail wagging faintly whenever someone glanced his way. The red bandana around his neck caught the sunlight, its colour vibrant against his golden fur. As the day wore on, Bo's breathing grew slower, his body sinking deeper into the blanket. The family gathered around him, their hands resting gently on his fur. Calvin leaned down, his voice breaking as he spoke. "You brought us back together, Bo," he said. "You reminded us what it means to love, to forgive. We'll never forget that." Bo's eyes closed slowly, his body relaxing completely. His final breath was quiet, a soft exhale that seemed to carry with it all the love and loyalty he had given so freely. The family sat in silence, the weight of the moment settling over them. Anna wiped away her tears, her gaze fixed on the oak tree's branches swaying gently in the breeze. "We should give him a place here," she said softly, "where he can always be with us." Calvin nodded, his jaw tight as he fought back tears. "Under the tree," he said. "It's where he belongs." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they laid Bo to rest beneath the oak tree. Calvin dug the hole with care, his movements deliberate and reverent. Anna placed a small wooden plaque at the base of the tree, inscribed with the words, "Bo, our hero, our family." Ryan tied the red bandana around one of the lower branches, its vibrant colour standing out against the bark. The three of them stood together, their arms around one another, as the first stars appeared in the sky. The air was cool, filled with the soft rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. "He's still with us," Anna said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Always." Calvin placed a hand on the tree, his gaze unwavering. "Thank you, Bo," he said softly, "for everything." As they turned to head back inside, the garden seemed brighter, the air lighter. The pain of their loss was profound, but so was the peace Bo had left behind, a legacy of love, loyalty, and redemption. The seasons passed, painting the old house in hues of life and renewal. Spring brought bursts of wildflowers along the fence, their vibrant colours framing the yard. Summer arrived with its long, golden days, filling the air with the sound of children's laughter. In fall, the oak tree shed its leaves, scattering golden-brown reminders of time's steady march. And through it all, Bo's presence lingered, an unshakable part of the family's story. Underneath the oak tree, where his small grave rested, the grass grew lush and green, a contrast to the once neglected yard. The red bandana tied to a low-hanging branch swayed gently in the breeze, a constant reminder of his loyalty and courage. Oliver, the youngest member of the family, was now old enough to understand the stories. At 5 years old, he loved to sit beneath the tree and listen as his parents recounted tales of the dog who had saved their lives in more ways than one. "Tell me again," Oliver said one afternoon, his voice filled with the curiosity only a child could possess. He sat cross-legged on the blanket spread under the tree, his wide eyes fixed on his father. Calvin, now a man transformed by the lessons of the past, knelt beside him, his hands, calloused from months of restoring the house and garden, gently ruffled the boy's hair. "Bo was the bravest dog I've ever known," Calvin began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "When we were at our lowest, when I made the biggest mistake of my life, he didn't give up on us. He came back and reminded us of what really matters: family, love, and forgiveness." Oliver's eyes flicked to the bandana swaying in the wind. "Is that why it's there?" he asked, pointing. Calvin nodded. "That bandana was given to him by someone who believed he deserved to belong, and Bo proved, every day, that he did." Oliver smiled, his small fingers brushing against the cool grass. "I wish I could have met him." Anna, sitting nearby on the porch, chimed in with a gentle laugh. "You have, sweetheart. Every time you laugh, every time you show kindness to someone, Bo's legacy lives on through you." The family had rebuilt not just their home, but also their sense of purpose. Calvin had found work again, repairing farm equipment for local neighbours, and Anna had started a small flower business, her garden blooming with new life. Ryan, though technically a guest when he first arrived, had become like an older brother to Oliver. He spent most weekends at the house, helping with chores and sharing in the joy of the little boy's endless energy. Ryan often found himself drawn to the oak tree. It was a place of solace, a reminder of how Bo had saved him, not just on that bridge, but in ways he couldn't fully articulate. On quiet evenings, he would sit there, his fingers brushing against the engraved plaque at the base of the tree. "You're still watching over us, aren't you?" Ryan murmured one evening, his voice soft against the backdrop of crickets and rustling leaves. "Thank you, Bo, for everything." Years later, the house became known as a place of warmth and hospitality in the small, tight-knit community. Visitors would often remark on the garden's beauty or the peacefulness of the oak tree. Many noticed the red bandana tied to its branch and asked about its significance. "It's a reminder," Calvin would say, his voice calm but firm, "that love and loyalty can heal even the deepest wounds." Oliver, now a teenager, carried Bo's story with him everywhere he went. At school, he told his friends about the dog who had braved storms, faced down predators, and saved a boy from certain death. At home, he made sure the oak tree remained a sacred space, often sitting beneath it to reflect. One summer evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, the family gathered around the oak tree. They brought out a small table and chairs, setting up a quiet dinner under the sprawling branches. The air was warm, the kind of evening that felt timeless. As they ate and laughed, the conversation turned, as it often did, to Bo. "Do you think he knew how much he meant to us?" Anna asked, her voice soft but steady. "He knew," Calvin replied, his eyes fixed on the bandana. "Dogs like Bo, they don't need words to understand love. They feel it, they give it, and they leave us better than they found us." Oliver leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the sky now dotted with stars. "I think he's up there," he said with quiet certainty, "watching us, making sure we're okay." Ryan, now a young man with a confident demeanour and a kind heart, nodded in agreement, and reminding us to be brave, even when it's hard. The family sat in comfortable silence, the night wrapping around them like a warm blanket. The oak tree's leaves rustled gently, as if whispering a quiet agreement. The years continued to pass, but the lessons Bo had left behind remained. The family grew stronger, their bonds unshakable, their love for one another a testament to the dog who had brought them back together. Bo's story became part of the family's legacy, told to new generations with the same reverence and gratitude. Under the oak tree, where his body rested and his spirit lingered, life continued to thrive. The flowers in the garden bloomed brighter, the swing in the yard creaked with the laughter of children, and the bandana on the branch swayed gently, a silent but powerful reminder of the courage, love, and loyalty of a dog named Bo.